for coming to our session today. If you're enjoying if you're not from Portland, you're enjoying the weather, and if you're from Portland, I hope you're surviving the weather. It's been uniquely hot. But I actually a little bit cooler. I wore a suit today, just to seem a little cooler than normal. My name is Charles Kelly, and with me today is Stan Curtis from Urban Systems and John Keener from Open Commons, and we have been having a conversation for a couple of years, and each of us have been committed to doing different work. And part of the conversation, we're going to be presenting part of that conversation to you today, and then hopefully engaging you in part of that discussion. That really comes. So I'm going to make a brief introduction. Stan is going to talk about really posing a question. Actually, this presentation is going to start with a question. We're going to give you some information, and we're going to ask another question. So be listening to what we're saying so that if you form a different question than we asked, you can further the discussion. But to start out, Stan is going to talk about kind of sort of get us thinking about, are we measuring the right things as we're building and applying technology? John is going to talk about how we're connecting communities, how data is able to connect communities in ways that we can use. And I'm going to be trying to explain how meaning and purposeful improvements can leverage that data and make places for people. So we're going to go from the data to the placemaking. So in planning for our discussion, I think what we'd be asking you to do is listen for ideas that connect data and placemaking, and what are the community expectations that we need to honor or leverage to make places that are desirable and yield tangible, visible, and economic benefits for the people who live there. So consider how, we'll be really considering how the city platform, as a platform generating that, how data informs that platform, what ways in the city, the change in the city, of the form of the city can attract people and serve their interests, and maybe they're serving their health outcomes or some new outcome that they can't imagine. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Stan.
Okay, thanks, Charles. I think I have another walk around. Is this on? Test? Am I good? Switch it.
I think also just speak loudly. We can hear you pretty effectively over here. So
Is this better?
A little bit better.
No? That'd be good. Okay.
I think you're right.
Well, these questions of what we should measure are global, and they're actually quite different depending on what part of the globe or what kind of a city is your context. Some cities are growing, some cities are shrinking. And so the emerging geography version and even the mature geography versions are quite different. So the very first thing about what should we measure, it really depends on your context. And every day in the news, there's a new disaster that we need to be getting prepared for. And I remember crawling under the desk and being ready for the nuclear bomb. I remember reading about the population bomb and how many kids I shouldn't have. And I remember about climate change, and it's actually an extreme sixth extinction like we've never had in a long, long time. And then there's the weather conditions. You want to read every day what kind of storm we're going to have and be ready for the big one, right? The big bomb, the big whatever it is, news item. So those things change day by day, and they're actually very personal. So depending on whether you're in Oregon or not, we have the big earthquake. And so we've just changed what we need to measure around resilience because we know that's a very big thing and it's real. It's not going to go away. And then the sad news is that we all have some health problems, but actually we have an opiate addiction. We have an opiate epidemic. And the Surgeon General says, oh, it's not only opiates, it's loneliness. We have a loneliness epidemic. So depending on where you are in your life and with your family, the role with respect to your family, these issues are all quite different. But there is sort of an inconvenient truth. Just like Al Gore sort of got the Nobel Prize going, that there's some big things happening. The geologists are telling us this is all our fault. It's an Anthropocene era, and a lot of that has to do with our behavior. So when we think about measuring, I think we want to be thinking about not only geology and physical measurements like temperature and air quality, but we also want to be thinking about the feedback loop of how those become more dense. And so if you look at from a geological, these are the Painted Hills in Oregon, and they're famous for the geological time rings granularity for dating fossils and Anthropocene events. But the carbon rings are separate from the plastic rings, are separate from the concrete rings that you can see through space, are big things that are happening. But I think it's not just the things, it's also the feedback. So humans are really great at domesticating biology. And it's not, we're the species that's killing off the other species. So we're a third of the biomass of all the mammals on Earth. And most of the other two are the things that we chose to domesticate to eat. So this is a big issue of balancing the metrics. And the trick of these metrics is they're kind of nested. So we learned from Yellowstone, sort of a shocking example of resilience. There's this huge fire, it's back. And there were wolves introduced. There's just a small population of wolves, but they have this behavior that rebalances the whole food pyramid in such a way it changed the growth of trees, changed the runoff of water, and rerouted rivers. So these things are very connected. And the tricky part of measuring is to know which things are nested and how they're going to feed back. So it's not just a measure, it's actually kind of a process of how you go about improving the feedback. So this is actually a very fun mathematical problem. Oh, there it is. It moved. So there's some inconvenient truths about measuring the things you can see and about measuring and hoping for cost efficiencies. So we know we can measure the location of cars. We know cars have a big carbon footprint, so they're one of the things we should measure. And one of the things you can do is see how long cars are sitting doing nothing or doing annoying things like being stuck on a freeway. So the university that's collected the most data about cars and traffic is the one that's funded by trucking. And the metric that they keep track of is how much cars slow down trucking. So they're very concerned about congestion. So in Houston, they focused on interpreting the congestion data and widening freeways. This is 24 lanes. And the faster they widen it, the faster it gets back to the same congestion level. It's called a Breas Paradox. And it's no matter what you measure, the behaviors can either spin positive or spin negative. And there's this induced behavior that spins congestion bigger and bigger and bigger. So this is a tricky measurement issue, and it's been generalized to work for every utility. So I work for IBM Smart Cities, and we did a lot of complexity systems models. And the embarrassing thing about the utility by utility efficiency model is it's futility. The more you work on efficiency, the more they abuse it. And even the LED thing that turned out free, now we have too much nightlight, and it's not necessarily what we'd hoped for in terms of the progress. So one of the famous ones for this, besides the mathematical feedback problem, is once you've measured stuff and gotten it to improve, did you really get the result that you're hoping for? So there was early on a focus on clean tech and a focus on energy, because coal-powered buildings had a chance to really improve the quality of air. So there's a lot of focus on how to get net zero efficiencies for buildings. And one of the embarrassing things was to build net zero buildings that had that generated a lot of traffic. So some of the very first LEED platinum buildings were actually carbon generators from the traffic. And you see this even in Silicon Valley. People are doing these showcase campuses. Norman Foster, one of the famous architects on the planet, designed this great building for the Apple campus. Has more parking spaces than it has office spaces. Is that a good design? Well, yes, in some ways, but depending on what you want, if you're focused on improving Silicon Valley into a more livable community, that might not be the thing you want to be famous for. Unfortunately, this is true of our national laboratories. So a lot of our laboratories are funded for specific technology goals, and then they publish famous things about a net zero parking lot. And I can remember reading a bunch of articles of 5 years ago, how to get a net zero green building. And one of the most popular structures that people were piloting was parking lots, because they were simple tests for going a net zero, and but this is an unfortunate situation. So there's this learning curve that is not a lead building that you care about. It's a lead neighborhood that you care about. And the neighborhood properties aren't just net zero energy, but they want to be high occupancy, high activity, and other kind of metrics. So you really have to think about what you want. And then as you're solving the problem incrementally, you have to keep expecting the feedback loops to get more important and be sure you're doing the things that matter. So taking a gas engine and electrifying the car, that does help, take out carbon footprint, but it might increase the number of cars on the road. So if you keep on going, you might not just care about the carbon footprint that you're generating from each car, but you might care about how many total cars are on the road and how much space you have to allocate for people to take longer trips or shorter trips. So the revolutions that are going on aren't only EV and autonomous vehicles, but also shared rides and ride-sharing services. So you have to keep going in the direction that makes holistic sense. And one of the good news items is they feed back. That if you start getting more sharing of electrical microgrids, you start getting more sharing of rides, you start feeding back. And what Obama found with his smart grid, smart transit, if you invest in smart grid at the same place you're investing in smart transit, the same place you're investing in smart housing, those feed back and it spins positive to be a higher thing. So if you look at a tale of two cities more holistically and think about how do things feed back to benefit each other, utility by utility, there's quite an advantage and quite a difference between these two cities. They'll all work. You can improve by electrifying your bus fleet. But the ability to do ride sharing, the ability to provide shared services is much different between these two cities. Here's Atlanta with 2.5 million people. Here's Barcelona with 2.5 million people. And they're both upgrading their transit system to include light rail and more electric choices. For the same amount of money, Barcelona covers over 80% of their city. And that's a huge benefit to most everyone in the city. In Atlanta, there's much less equity. The place doesn't connect that much, more like 20% of the city. And so to do this same technology in Atlanta is more than 10 times more expensive. It's exponentially more expensive for mass transit, for parking, for building density. So this is not a new phenomenon. That we've known this for a long time. We've had 1 million person cities for a long time, and we've known the density of development is a key to many performance metrics. So this is a very quick way to help think about how to get more leverage out of your investment dollars, and especially if you're in a shrinking city, sort of how to focus your investment dollars. So the good news, I think, from all this is it's not so much about what to measure, it's more the scalability of those patterns once you've sort of figured out how to get them changing and improving. So the nice Jane Jacobs talks about this, Santa Fe talks about this. A lot of people have realized that the planet is really composed of a bunch of city clusters. And the city clusters are scalable. So you can take the planet, think of it roughly as 100 city clusters, and then take those city clusters, and they're roughly 10 cities, take the cities and decompose them into communities and neighborhoods, and then you can get down to a 10,000 person neighborhood. So Joe Zender, gave a very nice presentation, and he's done the Portland version of a complete neighborhood. And metro decomposed into multiple cities, the cities decompose into roughly 100 neighborhoods. So a lot of cities come to Portland to see how to decompose a problem and not get stuck on the utility version of the problem, get down to the community version. So one of the things that this was supposed to be about sort of transportation planning and what to measure around transportation. And the claim is that if we think more about what kind of neighborhood do we want, we'll measure more of the right things about the transportation. That you can see from Atlanta, just putting in transportation choices, or Houston, just putting in transportation choices, isn't going to scale in a meaningful, positive way. This is a much more important approach. So Charles is really going to explain a lot of the community models that have that positive feedback that's scalable. these are some of the outlines for that, and there's many good questions that we can talk about for that. But the key point is it's not just physical things you're measuring. You have to measure things that are going to feed back to higher levels and be ready to think about it as an economic model where it's win-win. The key to positive feedback is what I do helps you, what you do helps me, and it feeds back so that the community is getting, everybody puts in $1 and shares $10 of good behaviors. So I've got a couple examples of measurements that are kind of popular. This is an example from the Clinton Climate Initiative, very famous, kind of focused on resilience. There are over 40 cities now that are part of the climate initiative. Portland's one of them, smaller ones. And this is our Clinton Climate Experiment. It is a community, it's not just transit. It's the Clinton Triangle for those that are local. And there's a certain amount of housing that's expected, a certain amount of office that's expected, a certain amount of retail that's expected. So it's a mixed use 724 potential opportunity with a very small experiment on how to make that balanced with several schematics of what might be done. So in some ways, this could be an aspirational experiment for figuring out what to measure, and I think there's many good things about it. But contrast that with another community that's thinking about measuring quality of life and how inspirational this would be to maybe getting people to contribute to the economy, to contribute to the improvement, not just get rid of carbon, but actually make this a more healthy place to live. So I think the World Economic Forum has said, let's get past measuring stuff. It's not, we don't need more cars, we don't need more buildings, we don't need more GDP. We need more wellness in some way. It's a mental health kind of issue. How does this community inspire better behavior? How does this community inspire better health? And it feels like it just automatically you see visually that this is about trees. This isn't just about buildings. This has some open air features that are more traditional, amber lighting, not over LED lit at night. And the buildings don't look like cement fortresses. They look like they're kind of urban gardens. And so these things all feed back in a different way. And I think you can tell that the community is thinking about lots of activities, not just thinking about cars, not just thinking about carbon, not just thinking about lighting, but more of a total inclusion. So one of the things we've seen as we've looked at lots of cities, and Charles will go through some different global examples, is that there's lots of good things to measure. You need a baseline, the ISO standard for getting a baseline, that's just goodness. You want to get on the scales every day. But, the feedback may not be the same across cities. The economic weighting factors may be different. So I think you'll see in Charles' talk that, like in Beijing right now, people are dying because of air quality. So you can measure carbon footprint and stuff. They've got particles, and people are dying. So they've got to really quickly get on top of that air quality issue. We've had water quality issues. People are dying of, the plague in Idaho. First one in a while. But those things are public issues, and so water quality and air quality, those can be really urgent. But for the most part in the developed countries, those things are not the biggest issue, and they might be things like loneliness. They might be things like equity. And so in San Francisco, a very rich city, it might be the homeless people and the equity. No one can afford a home, and so the bottom end of the pyramid is really changing the quality of life for everybody. And the same kind of thing like Portland. We have an earthquake here, and we don't have any safe places. So it may be that we can afford to upgrade our schools based on earthquake protection. So this is really a learning experiment, and this is sort of a Nobel Prize winning topic, that it's about having a commons. It's about sharing. It's about our behavior on how we manage our shared place, our shared places. So Eleanor Ostrom pointed out, it can spin positive. If we do this right, we can invest incrementally and improve it. And then Jane Jacobs said, it's not about roads. It's about people and the activity mix that they really want. And they will naturally innovate, and they will naturally form better and better economies if you give them a chance, if you make it a fair game. And so this is something Deloitte has picked up as a key trend globally. They are leading a smart city thing that talks about collective intelligence. And the learning curves, and there's sort of this exponential thing, but it's really just learning. That people are learning patterns that help adopt to all the things that are changing. Technology is really cranking. Faster and faster cell phones and cell phone apps for ride sharing and apartment sharing. And that's changing the business model for how much retail we need. There's now a bunch of empty malls. How much office space and hotels we need. We might be overbuilt. And then it really changes the policies around safety. So these are behavior feedback challenges, and more of these kind of measures are getting to dominate what makes for a good place. So it'll be fun going through the different examples, but I don't expect the same. I don't expect, this is the last slide. I don't expect one change to be the same for each city. So in a mature place like Europe, where they've had million-person cities for 1,000 years, some of these cities are growing and some of these cities are shrinking. And the kinds of behaviors that are needed for a certain age mix, it's not just about schools for kids in a pyramid. It's a chimney. There's as many elder people, and you want in-home care. You don't want hospitals like schools. You want in-home care for multiple generations. So that's sort of the description of the problem, the lessons learned from IBM Smart Cities, the lessons learned from Portland, and how well complete neighborhoods seem to scale, and then how much the kinds of things we measure has changed over time from water and pollution to equity and a more balanced set of choices. Thank you.
So my name is John Teeter, briefly introduced before, and I won't dwell on a whole lot because the real punchline is coming with Charles. But I am happy to be here, and I do thank the GCTC and the organizers, Urban Systems, and the Oregon Tech Council too, for bringing this forward. Oops. So, that's interesting. The slides have changed.
The graphic, someone decided graphically, it's cooler.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. I guess I can look at it here. So we're talking about metrics and what we need to measure and how the metrics might be responsive to the data or drive the data that we're acquiring from our communities. I want to start from a little bit different perspective. Stan started from a very global perspective. I want to change it down to a personal perspective as I move through my day and what kind of things I should be measuring. As individuals, we think about how we interact with our environment, how our life cycles work, but we're thinking of the people and the services that we're using throughout that day and how we provide kind of those feedback loops, not on the monthly, yearly, fine or high grade granularity, but how do I bring that back to the next 5 minutes? What am I doing in 10 minutes? It's things that we have to deal with and the choice if we want to live our life as we move through. And that leads us to patterns of living, which are really being undertaken in the context of how we view the interactions we have with our spatial environment that we're moving through. It can be positive with respect to that. We can frame it with respect to negative. And either way, we are basically bringing forth our personal interactions with this smart city environment or evolving city environment as we're moving forward. So in that, we have outside stimuli to those decisions or the patterns. What's the weather today? Do I need my umbrella? Do I not need my umbrella? Is it bad enough that I should just stay home as on a snow day? So it changes the way I act, the way I take action through my day. If I'm looking at a dense traffic pattern on my commute, is it possible for me, my lifestyle, my patterns, to be able to stay home? And if I do stay home, the fact that I stayed home Is that going to affect the transit system because it's one less person that's going to be involved in it? How much of this information flow will we support, and what effect will it be on my neighbors and the other people that are involved in my community? Things that I have to do on a cyclic basis that are community stimulated, such as I have to take the trash out because the community has agreed that my waste stream will be initiated on a given day. It's a community agreement that I've come down to. The connectivity tissue, the interactions that individuals have with their community is, I think, one of the driving forces that we really need to do. And beyond the way information shapes our daily living patterns, we'd like to think it's all very clear. Oops. Escape that. It's all very clear, but sometimes it's contradictory. I mean, I could be one day reading in the paper that I should eat more carbs, or I should like get out and exercise and really burn that away to become more healthy. And then the next day I might read that I should be eating more veggies, which is kind of contradicting the first thing. And when really the best thing would be I should just eat less and kind of gauge my life patterns to the underlying energy consumptions that my life patterns bring. So we have contradictory information that we have to sort and live through. But in the end, our connected communities have to support all of that stuff. They have to help us sort out all these discontinuities in the information stream, the contradictions. It needs to help us understand, to be empathetic with the other members of my community. And it really needs, most importantly, to help guide our collective decisions as we decide where we want our community to go. And my community, somewhat different than the community in Portland, the neighborhood you might live in, would come to a different conclusion entirely, I'm sure, in my case. That must be honored and supported by the underlying connectivity tissue of the community. Till we get to the point where we have resiliency and livable communities, it's got to bring out the best in us. It's got to encourage that, not say, and it's kind of like a prohibitive mechanism. Like, we don't want to say, you can't do that. We want to make sure that we want to do what is the best for us and for our whole community, and nurture our dreams, and basically lead us to the point where we've got support and security. I just want to point out that I've talked in generalities, and I'll pretty much stay in generalities. Through the rest of this conference, we've seen examples of what specific cities are doing in specific areas to tie this all together. But I think we all need to have, as we make those specific decisions, a holistic view of why we're making those decisions and what's driving us forward. So as a kind of aspirational statement, this is to sponsor or support our aspirations moving forward and dreams. That's not to say that we shouldn't be finding baseline standards so we can compare in an apples to apples way as much as we can, whether we are successful or not. So we can set our goals, our stakes in the ground in such a way that those goals are driving collections of communities across the globe to a common way. So I'll just make passing comment to one of the standards, which we may all want to look at, that provides a way to evaluate our success. Now the economic, all these 50, 70 odd standards are broken or cascaded up into 17 themes, which means there's complexity underneath each one of these. Telecommunications is just one point. I'm very happy to say under the GCTC umbrella, we have many of the domains that are talked about here collaborating in specific projects that allow that bleeding across of the domains to occur and to influence our outcomes. But it is very important, and I would encourage all of you to be very familiar with the metrics that are needed or that are evolving, and the way that we can say, I want to be like Boise, just to choose a random city, because the quality of life there is such that it's the #1 hipster city in America. So if I had a hipster goal in my future, I might want to find the best of that. And metrics that are kind of baselined across these populations of cities is a good way to do that. one way to help accomplish that is to make sure that we have access to the common set of capabilities and platforms so that two cities can leverage successes without excessive barriers to doing that. So if I have a successful water management system like in Porto, Portugal, I'd like to be able to put that in Boise without having to do a re-implementation, reinvestment to reach the point of deploying a successful system. So open source and open platforms is something that I'm definitely a proponent of, and open data streams that flow into those things. And I know it's a world where it's possible to get locked into different silos. I want to encourage you all to avoid that. Keep to an open standard, open framework, thus open commons, so that we can easily share and support each other as we move forward. And then, as we look at that, we need to actually, that word virtualized probably should be visualized. Because really, once we get all this information flowing, the data streams flowing, if I can't interact with it in a very useful and unimpeded way, then it really won't be useful for me to make my decisions. Now, some of that happens in terms of visualization of the data in the mobility sense. That might happen through an Uber app. It's my point of interaction with my mobility system. Multimodal applications that would take me across different from bicycle all the way up to high-speed rail or even airplane. One uniform way of visualizing that at the personal level is, I believe, where we are going. It may be a competitive evaluation or that picks the best winner. It may be a municipality, a TriMet could put out for this region the unifying interface into all of the transportation data, and the various stakeholders would then use the same information streams to extract, I want to get from point A to B, I want to understand how I should be reformatting or realizing my transportation system based on the patterns that have. So visualization of this, I think, is an important thing. And then the actual way that I encourage different municipalities or different communities to collaborate is important. I use the eco-district processes as an example here. Eco-districts are a Portland homegrown thing, but that has now gone global. But any agreement to an initiative that allows people to work together, start communities, there are many, many that we could work with or describe. So the patterns that we put together, social, physical, economically driven, all those patterns have different information flows. All those information flows need to be uncontainerized and spread across the other domains. The way we approach it, this is a kind of generic spiral of success, if you will, that sets out some suggestions as to how I might approach complex problems by breaking them into smaller parts. It's a spiral of success, and the spiral doesn't stop with that last one. It restarts. It restarts all the time. And so that restart is something that is more difficult in jurisdictions that have disparate membership. I mean, if you don't have common ideals, it's more difficult to keep the engagement flowing. But it is a flow. It's not a single shot thing at all. And so finally, the concept of governance. In my arena, we talk about government, data governance. How do I make decisions about the appropriateness of a given data stream to fit into the global information space that's driving my community decisions? There has to be, I think, the community itself has to kind of govern that. In this particular slide, the asynchronous government, what we're trying to project there is that we have a technology base, an open platform that is being used across many different initiatives, that allows the initiatives to cross-fertilize each other, and that the asynchronous governance is that I can make a decision over here that will affect a behavior over here in a different initiative. And so I kind of want to leave you with that lack of rigidity and allowing the community to drive the information flows, the data streams that are the connective tissue of the nervous system of the city. That's really where I think we should go. And so with that, abstractious, I'll pass it back to Charles to give some reality to some of these things.
Thank you, John. Well, one of the title of my section is Giving Meaning, Purpose to Urban Form. And the main reason that I cite this is because the city has been incredibly adaptive over the 7,000 years of its existence to adapt to different changes in human activity and behavior. And I would just say that it's become more increasingly populated, the stakes are higher, right? And that is, I think, really gets to the question of what Stan was saying, is that these are not only more frequent, but there are bigger deals because more people are affected. And now we have this common bond to solve this. And then to the point that John was saying, we really have technology now to unify us in ways to help us react in new and more efficient ways and more effective ways. So Portland kind of represents this because they, in the early years, it was not like it is today. It was out of compliance in air quality and water quality. And there were seriously 180 days where it was out of compliance, and they couldn't receive any block grants from the federal government as long as they were out of compliance with these water standards. And the city didn't have a lot of money at that time, and they relied on that money because they were building freeways, honestly. And what they did is they said, well, we need to do something about it. And they recognized that they needed to change the form of the city. They needed a new system of how people arrived downtown. They realized that all their water quality and air quality were really from the emissions of all these cars that were coming downtown and leaving on the freeways that they were building. And they needed to give some incentive for people to take another means of mode of travel to downtown. And what the city came up with was, let's build a transit mall that makes that last minute or the last mile of that travel from the bus to my destination an enjoyable one, so that in fact that's a better and equal choice to driving downtown by car looking for a parking lot and stuffing my car in some parking lot. And in fact, most of the downtown was encumbered with all the moves of the automobile, but they took great steps to remedy that and got a whole new pattern of behavior going in the city. And in the Pearl District, well, it's known as the Pearl District now, but originally it was the River District. This was where they used that same concept of giving the people on their own inclination, using their choice in making their trip include a pedestrian or active use transportation system by improving the open space, the continuity and character of open space across the city to unite where people worked with a new area called the Pearl District where people would live. And then they came up with the idea of using a streetcar that would expedite and connect these people living and working in the downtown to employment, everything. And they had enough community support by all the successes that they had by changing the system of downtown and changing the air and water quality, making the process of progress, that this became part of the ethic of the city in itself. And they were able to strike development agreements with the community support, the community would benefit, they understood those benefits, and they became a joint partner. They formed development agreements, they created a new governance structure to support this systems. And so you'll see that what people really come to see now is that there's this stewardship entities that are now taking ownership and offloading some of the cost of the maintenance of these open space systems by the residents and the businesses that live there. And that's what most of the storyline of the Pearl District is related to now, is that businesses are successful, residents are successful, and they both share the same ingredient of that success, was how they're connected together. And that's an important eco-district system concept that was the foundation of an eco-district idea that we took to Japan and were hired to assist in the development of Japan's signature smart city development that was attempting to make it a place where the business and the community interests shared a common goal in the character and quality of open space to connect the occupants of this district, marginally to attract tech people to move to, tech companies to move there, because those tech companies were trying to attract and retain high quality talent, and they knew that the quality of the open space and the amount of services that they received and the experience that they had was a major determination of who you could attract. And then the residents of this neighborhood decided they would be the beneficiary if they could attract businesses that would attract such people, because they would pay for the open space systems that they needed. The real story behind Keshwa is that it started as a signature of Transoriented Development in 2005 when it opened. By 2009, after the Great Reset happened, they were looking for ways for City Forum to help communities emerge from the disaster of the Great Reset in 2008, 2009. So they used and created, Hitachi, you'll see in a minute, created an area energy management system and a technology system to communicate with the occupants to save money. And then in 2011, they had the Tohoku earthquake. And then that changed this district again, because it then turned that area energy management system into a supporting resiliency tool that has now formed this district as the ULI Global Award for Excellence and the largest LEED and D Platinum certified smart city in the world. And I like saying all that stuff together because it just seems impossible that actually happened, but it did. The thing here is that they had this technology, and when we arrived, the technology was connecting these occupants. They had connect and peak shade, resource use. When after the Tohoku earthquake, they put batteries on the system so they could be off the grid for 3 to 4 days. And they had a forward-facing Toshiba user interface that connected with the occupants and connected them on the daily use of their resources in the district, connected them to daily activities in this district. And they even gave them incentives that if they met their goals for water, waste, and energy reductions, they could get credits in a local store. And so the occupancy became very engaged in all this, but the space between the buildings was rather lacking, and they asked us to come up with a concept. And they didn't ask us, they had created an entity since 2005, which I think is really the best thing that's the story of Keshwa, is that they made a self-governance entity that sits and connects all those different siloed entities that give form to cities in a way that sustained the life of the development. So over this 15, 20-year period, it went from TOD to economic resistance to economic shock to a sustained and resilient community, and now a smart city. It was all done because this entity convened the community and got the community connected to what their aspirations were. And those people would pay a premium where they would use resources less in order to achieve that. And this is that dynamic connection of smart city that I think it's not just IoT. Smart city in this case is in direct engagement with the community and finding what they want, delivering it on that. I'm going to shift gears a little bit because I'm going to show you how we're trying to import this to the United States. And the first project that we did when we came back to the United States was write an anti-poverty plan for the African American community here in Portland. Portland is the number one on the gentrified city list. They have serial gentrification, they have serial displacement, and it's largely because the core areas of our community were severely redlined and maintained through Jim Crow and then de facto segregation, concentrated African American communities in North Portland. And then it's been the economy has been displacing those folks throughout the whole city into places where there is no service, because that's the only place they can afford to live, because there's no services there. And so this plan was created in order to organize that community to work on their own behalf to improve those areas that are being displaced to, what we call anchor areas, and the places that they're being moved from, where all their cultural services and cultural identity has been located, and trying to ways of connecting those things across the city in a plan. And we suggested they form an urban design center, Keshwa, because we thought that was a good way of having them work and coordinate their work, wealth, and wisdom as a larger community. They knew what kinds of places that they need and services that they wanted. They didn't want just more housing. They wanted a community that was strong enough that could afford the market rate housing in the district. They didn't want, well, housing's not the measurement for the African American community, it's community and what they can do together and have autonomy and have some self-direction in their life. They even knew where to put this. We met and convened with them. They could tell us what they needed where and how and what would contribute to a more vapor community, create more health in their, and more innovation in their community. And then we outlined what, in general terms, what this coordinating entity might be, but it was basically giving this community the information on how to harness the tools and effective levers of urbanism in their interest and use and form partnerships with allies, advocates, and allies, and champions, a lot of great people who would help them and benefit from their success. Finally, we were invited by the city of San Francisco to import what we had learned from resiliency and sustainability in Japan to test how well their eco-district in Central Soma might perform if they, when they increased or upzoned the district. And I'm gonna grab my battery because I'm not plugged in.
Oh.
Where's my? Anyway, they asked us to evaluate the success of the existing Central Soma, the policies that they were about ready to implement through the upzoning, and whether or not it could ever be net positive for water, net positive for waste, net positive for energy. In other words, it was a regenerative community where there was more benefits than impacts, and that they could, through localism and cyclical economy, could begin to pay for many of the services due to a higher density of occupants. In many ways, the way they do it in Japan, by using density to concentrate subscribers so that you can share costs more equitably at different moves in the community. So it's essentially adding more than tripling the current development in the area. So there's a lot on the table. We, with our partner Regencia, they have a regenerative standard tool that allows them to look across all the silos to measure the success of what the existing district, how it was performing, how the cyclical economy was working. They had, they estimated if you applied all the standards and policies that were in the eco-district that was going to be adopted with the increase of the lifting of the entitlements, they scored a little bit better. And then, but not in a regenerative way. There was still many impacts and less benefits. But they asked us, well, what would we propose that they do given what we've learned in Asia Pacific here in San Francisco? And when we applied those and studied them, we came up with a pathway for what they could do. That number one pathway was to separate fresh and salt water after an earthquake. And then you'll have to do something to pump that water out of those areas that have differential settlement through liquefaction. And if you're going to spend that money to protect the assets that you already had, you can easily use it to do heat exchange and be a water source and do a number of other things with it. So we had a concept for that. We had a concept for just connecting the waste streams, the water streams, and trying to link the water nutrient and energy through that water system. And City of San Francisco was using this thought process with all the bureaus that we convened to determine what SFPUC, how they would allow or permit each of these amazing projects that are coming online to treat their own wastewater. But they didn't have a policy for dispersed wastewater treatment that adopted and used all the technology that was available in current time. They're still working on that 18th century model. And they recognized that they were using this thought cloud to do that. We were using what we learned in Catchment Hall of connecting the occupants to the place. And then we were, Regencia has this concept where you can do urban acupuncture and place nutrient and heat exchange devices that create more value in the community and connect them across in the right circumstances in the right places and you can actually generate revenue that the city would recognize but hadn't been capturing. And then they asked us, okay, well, how much is all this going to cost? And when we looked at it, the actual improvements for the infrastructure that would separate the water, make the green infrastructure, the surface improvements, transform the district was, a fractional incremental cost. The big cost in this regenerative plan for Central Soma was that all the existing buildings needed to be upgraded and connected. And that's the real cost barrier for regenerative urbanism, is for a whole district to work as a whole entity, it needs to be connected to its existing buildings. But even when we did that, it was only a $1.4 billion incremental cost. It was about 10% more than they had previously planned for the infrastructure for the area. But they ended up getting, through all these new benefits that they could monetize, we figured or estimated they could get $2.2 billion in return for that 1.4. But in the larger picture, they were always getting revenue out of this district from this current entitlement lift. We could probably add a little bit more entitlement to this and change even this picture, which is that they spend, or they just keep the $1 billion, well, not to confuse things, they're going to spend $3 billion. The city is going to extract $3 billion from all the development. If they kept some of the money in the district, they could get an extra $2 billion back, so that their pinwheel for benefit to the city for lifting this entitlement would go to $5 billion on a $1 billion increase in revenue, or increase in investment, and be the only regenerative community in the world. And I think that was the latter part that they were excited about. Because the money, it's a good idea and a good deal. It's just it's illegal to do such a thing. So as we go into the question and answer session, or the discussion, because we want to ask Stan a whole bunch of questions. Number one, that even I want to understand what the answer is, having to do with artificial intelligence, which might be the next unplanned natural disaster, human-made disaster. But the things that we might measure, if we're being more holistic, are what is the social mobility? How do we measure that? What is the long-term operational resource management stream, and how do we monetize that and use that savings to both visual and tangible benefits in the open space realm to connect people more wisely and with a sense of ownership, so they might be stewards of the space that they live in. What are the tangible benefits? Those tangible benefits, how much community cohesion are we creating? Because that's really, as through the African American community we work with in Japan, community cohesion, where there's community cohesion, and after the Tohoku earthquake study, when the big tsunami hit, Sendai tsunami hit, the places that had no social cohesion had far greater mortality rates than the places that had social cohesion. So the real remedy to resiliency and urban form is how does data and the place create cohesion so that they can adapt to these different things. So with that, I wanted to ask Stan this one question and then get everything going. Because I don't know the answer to this. We always talk about autonomous vehicles. We always talk about the things that might come that we might be worried about, the fall of retail as we know it. But I think I'd like to kick off this question for Stan and for anybody who wants to answer it. But we'll let Stan go first. How does artificial intelligence create opportunities for communities to use their neighborhoods more efficiently? And I think it's kind of an open question.
Yeah. So of course we can debate what is intelligence and then what is artificial improvement to intelligence. I think the embarrassing, inconvenient truth about social media and improved communication as a version of intelligence is that we now have a loneliness epidemic. Even though we have more bandwidth, better connection, a whole ton of data, it hasn't spun positive yet. We actually have more isolation, more mental health problems, and loneliness epidemic. So, one of the things we want to keep in mind is qualitatively is our life getting better. And one of the things we've said here is that it's sort of a feeling of community. It's sort of a behavior feeding back in a positive way to other people's behavior. So a very important part of intelligence that we could actually measure is sort of a sense of collective intelligence. And one of the things that's embarrassing about collective intelligence is it doesn't have a lot to do with the data. It actually has to do with feelings. And so when you look at what kinds of groups come up with better choices that are feeding back positive for better lifestyle choices, there are only 3 variables that really matter. And then one of them is not location. One of them is eye contact. So if you're in a group and you're trying to decide what to do, if someone's upset, and you're making eye contact and you recognize they're upset, then the more times you know if something was upsetting or something was pleasing, the better decision, the better recognition of the choices there's going to be. The second variable is, besides eye contact, did the person get a chance to say what they felt? So what percentage of the people participated in the conversation? And, not how many times they talked, but did everybody get a chance to at least contribute their issue, both good and bad, to what was important to the decision? And the third variable is kind of embarrassing for us guys, because it's gender specific. So women tend to be more sensitive to reading eye patterns and reading and eliciting more feedback. So the embarrassing situation is if you took a group of 10 people to make a decision, you took out one guy and put in a woman in their place, it, in general, make it for a better decision. So definitely we want to be inclusive of men and women's decisions, and diversity in the group is going to improve those things. So these, when we talk about metrics, the real gotcha is kind of blind spots. If you don't see an issue, that could really be a problem. And if you don't get the issue understood correctly, and you think it's about net zero, energy, and somebody over here doesn't worry about energy, but's worried about safety. One's life and death, and one is covered. So you gotta figure out who's scared, So I think those, artificial intelligence is interesting. There's cool games you can play and get really good at chess. But I think collective intelligence is more practical. And I think it really maps onto the meaning of smart city in a positive way. And it scales. So you could have a collective intelligence at a very small scale as a family, have a collective intelligence of a different group of friends. You can have a collective intelligence of communities of interest around pets, or communities of interest around gardens. Those things will feed back positive. And I think if you can get the community feedback, that collective intelligence version of intelligence, that's at the heart of good community and good smart behaviors.
Does anyone else have any feelings about this application of technology?
Artificial intelligence?
Yes.
Sure. I think that there are a number of services that AI can enable, which will facilitate the development and support of a city. So let's talk about public safety and security. So if a fire breaks out in a building, it's the sensors of the building that are going to know that the fire is there. It's going to be able to forewarn people not only within the building what to take place, but also the first responders immediately. If you know who is in the building and the profiles of the people in the building, you're going to know who has heart issues, who has particular kinds of issues, what floors are on. Great, the first responders are going to be able to be ready, both in terms of those who are going to working, whether it's fire, police, and also the EMTs, but also the hospitals are going to know the profiles and know what is necessary for that particular person in that particular moment, given the conditions that they're under. So I think that an AI can do it like this, much faster than a human being can do. So I think that there are I know that AI can be scary to people, but I think there are also definitely some benefits. Not just some. I think there are a lot of benefits that AI can do, which we will not be able to do and compute fast enough from an information perspective. And I think that's just one example.
I think another component AI brings forth is we're able to recognize the feedback loops that are created when we use machine intelligence and thus address our own implicit bias. So an example of that is looking at using an algorithm to advertise for a job. If it's continuously profiling one individual as the perfect candidate for that job, we then recognize the blind spot, everyone who's not being targeted for that job, and potentially recognize how we've created a society in which those other individuals aren't part of the conversation, and thus we can create more social cohesion by recognizing that.
That's a good point. Yes.
I would not believe that argument that much, because artificial intelligence is not created by itself. Somebody creates artificial intelligence. The people that create artificial intelligence, people in IT, there's not that much diversity in IT. So those who develop the patterns and the algorithms, develop the patterns and algorithms for their specific community. So if you don't have developers that are diverse, you cannot have artificial intelligence that understand what diversity really is.
Yes, absolutely.
Which go back to how do you recognize the problem in the communities? Well, we develop technology or we try to solve housing problems. Maybe other communities do not care about housing problems. They care about other type of connections.
They want a job, good
So
job.
who develops that technology is also important.
Yeah.
So if I may ask a question based on what you both just said, what about the artificial intelligence that learns, which we're getting to right now? So maybe the AI could actually learn and see, hey, hold on a second, you know what? Here's a pattern that we're seeing. In fact, these people are not being included. What do you think? Do you want to include these people? Because
Exactly.
the AI is going to have an intelligence level of its own ultimately.
But just, I mean, a lot of these things we already know. Like, the machine doesn't need to tell us that there's whole groups of people that are left out and left behind.
Right.
We know that.
The question is, do we want to see it?
Right, so we don't need a machine to have, like, we see it, we know it. You step out the door, we've like got a million statistics. So it gets back to, do we have, like a political will or consciousness to do anything with the information? Because we have a lot of information already today. And there's things that the AI can contribute to and the next new way it can improve. But there are also, like, there's so many things that we already know today and we don't do anything with information.
Absolutely. I would think sometimes, you need that third party though. You know how you go to a consultant, like somehow the people in the company are saying the same thing, but you go to a third party
So
consultant.
like our census data isn't our third party, like we can't use the data we got.
No, absolutely. I was just responding to the gentleman who said that maybe the AI, because it was programmed by someone else, already has the biases. And I was just saying that AI is going to evolve to a level where it's going to be self-determinant. And it's going to have its own intelligence and learning. And so that's why it can possibly show different patterns. But I agree with you. It's just remarking to his.
John, you had a comment.
No, actually, what Lewis was saying is characterizing an AI that's beyond just what the IT department is thinking that the AI can do. And that the ability of, I mean, it really is an artificial intelligence. So we shouldn't constrain it to the way we think about what programs and packages can do now. The anticipation is that once we bridge to real AI, is that it will think out of the box with us. It is intelligent, just as we are intelligent. We can think out of the box. By definition, it can too.
But I would just I want to just comment on that is that one of the things that when I do my urban design work, I will start meeting off like, what are you going to do with all the money I saved? Right? And that's really the hard question, is because that becomes then another community organizing decision, because we know that their greatest incidence of poverty per capita in the United States than anywhere else. I mean, it's huge. I mean, just in numbers of population. And we have our own internal, we've not done anything about it, but if we used, if AI were able to make and optimize, and there was this resource that we could use to properly or morally use, or in the community's interest, and I don't know who this community is that I'm talking about right now, but I'm assuming it's all America, all the people who want uplift in the United States and that for everybody else on the planet, you would get different political decisions, and that would, it's what you do with the data is what's becoming the challenge now. It's data and money and how do you budget? Who gets what, what gets done, and that is very hard right now. Go ahead.
I think one of the things, I think what kind of ties back into your second question there about the moral and ethical questions around that. When New Orleans rebuilt itself after the hurricane, the gentrification that occurred in that process and trying to figure out how do we reconstruct it in a way that still has the culture that it had before was a huge part of what they had to face. And you could say, well, financially, it's better to kick all the poor people out, the street vendors, and put in all new storefronts and be all shiny and new. But then you've lost the whole culture. And I think that's part of the struggle with everything we do is that we think about the money that we can save or the money that's derived out of the process. Stan?
Also, I really like the focus on culture, and I think that's another spin on intelligence. That, you know, we have, in some ways it's like a language. And if you can talk about death as a family, you can feel like it has more meaning. If you can talk about the quality of life, things that matter, it gives life more meaning. In some way, the slow food movement is to sort of give more language around the food events. And so I think in a lot of ways, you know, the intelligence to be able to understand Chinese culture, be able to study French culture, be able to understand Arabic and Muslim culture, we're getting there. You know, my daughter knows music in lots of different cultures, and my son knows, you know, religious patterns in lots of different cultures. So I think the intelligence for communication is really important, and the preservation of culture is richer and more rich. So you can look, I can look up, if I don't understand, I can do a Google Translate. I can go find what Qingdao means and where Confucius was born. So I understand the significance of that place and how important it is to get the culture right, not just a net zero building. Right?
But when government requires you to have inclusionary housing, but doesn't participate themselves in the process, is very interesting to me, because a great portion of our dilemma that we face each year with trying to keep some sort of inclusionary communities together is the fact that they've priced us out of the market to be able to do that without costing development the opportunity to ever make any money at all in the process. So I think that, you know, you can, monies that they would have never received to begin with ought to be given up. You know, organizations that do good practices like that ought to be rewarded, and ones that don't have good practices ought to be penalized. And I think that that's a pretty simple process to put into place if government would participate. But I find it very difficult for them to do anything other than tell us we need to do something.
Well, one of the nice things about learning different cultures is their culture of sharing. So when you look at the Indian culture of potlatch versus some of the other cultures, and you look at, you know, the Croatian culture coming to Mercy Corps in Portland, I think that ability to see those patterns and share the harmonious patterns of different cultures, that's improving our odds. You know, we may have more to harvest, and I think that's a positive version of machine learning. And I think in terms of the language, thinking of machines as a language assistant, you know, I have hearing aids. It's really important to me to be able to hear, and it's really fun to think of, you know, simultaneously talking to someone in Chinese, you know, coming through the translator automatically to me. So I think it's a real rich meaning of intelligence, and there's lots of community value created culturally in that language.
Anything more on that one?
It's really fascinating. I mean, I'm part of the panel tomorrow on nature and health and equity tomorrow morning, so this is really feeding into this discussion. But I come from an environmental psychology background, and so, you know, we have this idea of environmental identity, that people have beliefs and values about nature and the natural world. And I think it's possible that AI can have environmental identity, but it's not automatic. I mean, we would have to program it. So I think to the extent that we program AI systems that are using communities' values and manifest the community's identity, then it could be helpful for them. But it's not automatic, like the person says, there's so many cultural biases that we get and microaggressions that can be programmed into the system.
What strikes me is that if you program AI to look at social mobility, and then someone, a sociologist who studies such information and understands the data would help get data back, real data, on what that means in that community to whatever. But these are bigger concepts, right? But I think we do run off and monetize everything, or run off and save some money but not know what to do with it.
A significant thing in the impact of understanding of ecology, we thought only people talk.
Yeah.
But we know pets talk. We know actually that plants talk. And we know we actually get biofeedback from germs, directly from our gut, our second brain. So understanding the patterns of intelligence into a richer language has given us a broader feeling of connectivity. And so now people realize that forest bathing has mechanical reality, and that what we eat is signaling our pleasure in significant ways. So I think that is a rich intelligence improvement opportunity.
One small comment. I'm hoping that we will evolve past the term of the concept of programming the systems, because we really need to expose these systems to our behaviors and let them learn to shape their responses to what they perceive as things that might help us, rather than program them to do something.
And just one of the other riches around AI, it's only as good as the data that it gets. You talked about loneliness as being a significant factor today. It's opening up new roles for individuals that may have left the workforce but may act now as strong citizen scientists. And so in terms of measurements, we want to be able to feed back to them the riches that they're giving the next generation now that they're out of the workforce, the massive amount of information that is locally relevant that they can provide through technologies and their personal experiences as they experience the environments that we're providing. So I think there's a real opportunity to create citizen scientists that feel as if now they have a very important job. They're not forgotten. They see on a regular basis how much their group has contributed to whatever project it is they're working on.
And that is part of the feed forward loop as they do side of it, educate 2 generations down.
Right.
One more thing, and I think finding what everyone's saying is that AIs, don't think of it as, it's not zeros and ones, it's gonna have empathy. It's going to be able to reflect, it's going to sense. So it's gonna be like us, right? It's gonna be kind of an animal. And so, it can be a phenomenal tool in terms of reaching out. And sometimes, sometimes as human beings, we're not that good at sensing things actually, and not that good at communicating. Maybe it can help and teach us, or maybe it can be the ones that help and deal with that loneliness. Anyway, there's a lot of things that it can do, but it will not be, it's not cold, artificial intelligence. It's has a whole other level that it's going to possibly, well, we'll get to.
Anyone else fearful of change? I think that's the real thing that scares the heck out of me, is that what do I have to adapt to? And, could AI make us more resilient? Somehow, I'd say that in kind of a loose term, but that seems.
Well, I think the inconvenient truth is that, as we build more coupled systems, they can become more extreme in their tipping. And so we've actually accelerated the rate of change, and we've accelerated the sensitivity of the system feedback. So being able to dampen it down and being able to decouple is part of the opportunity, or part of the issue. And I think one of the things about sustainability and smart city that we're more appreciative of is resilience, because there's a feeling of more shocks happening and more shocks being big, and there's an overwhelming number of shocks to worry about, not just my weight, but my diabetes, not just my diabetes, but, the big one, here in Portland, the earthquake. And then I think being able to go through a very sophisticated system analysis, like the Bullet Center, you worked really hard on going net zero. But how good occupancy was the building? It was single use. So was that really the building that place needed? And the same thing with San Francisco. I mean, it's a brilliant job on looking at regenerative. But San Francisco's famous for the earthquake problem. And the earthquake problem is those buildings are on landfill that's not close to the way the Japanese would have coded for the building. So I think we always have these blind spots, and we have this feedback getting faster. And I think that's at the heart of how we need help. And I think that's why, the first slide talked about which is the big one. The big ones are next. So I thought at first it was a nuclear bomb. It hasn't happened yet, but it's still there. And I thought it's a population bomb. We went from 3 billion to 6 billion, and we're on our way to 10 and 12. And I'm still worried about Malthus dilemma. And then on top of that, we have these other epidemics that are caused by, I love Facebook, only now it's got a loneliness epidemic. My daughter's scared to put her kid on it, so I gotta get off of Facebook. And my phone's expiring every 2 years, I gotta upgrade my connection to society.
One of the things that what I love about working in Japan is how much they care for how services provided to them, how available it is, how they can get those services that they need. And the other thing I love about that is that when you ask a group of Japanese how many times they move in their lifetime, from one place to another, and you ask, and they're in the room with someone from the U.S. The U.S. has moved maybe 5 to 10 times in their lifetime, maybe more. A Japanese person maybe has moved twice. So they have a much more connection with the stability of the places that they live in, and in some ways I feel like that's what we sort of miss. They actually are very rooted in their place, and they accept all this dynamic change, or even they're very resilient. And it gives me hope that, in my business model of trying to make better places and part of the smart city discussion, that I'm actually, making some progress in that. But I think the place where people live and how feel they comfortable around other people, whether it's a dynamic, diverse community or a pretty homogeneous community, there is some comfort that AI is going to have to tap into to find, to help us navigate all this difficult change. Anyway.
I have a question. Open sourcing, which is a big thing these days, how does that protect intellectual property, and how do you factor that into, you're working both sides at the same time, and someone wants to open source, but they spend all their time and money on R&D, and now somebody else is going to get right access to it? How does that work?
John?
It has evolved forward. The first open source stuff I worked with was in the early 70s, actually, where people would open source packages, and we would reverse engineer these things. We would find the codes, we would reuse the code. And it's evolved to the point where it's understood that if we collectively do something that has benefit to all of the participants in my marketplace, I will have a better chance to specifically use that platform that others have contributed to inject particular value-added services on top of that platform. And that's effectively, if everyone has to do the same thing, we might as well do it together and share that way. And that's like tax reporting. If we had our act together, we wouldn't have specific businesses built up around that common thing that we all have to do. We would have a common platform that was open and shareable so that we would all do it, we would all do it the same, or we would all benefit from innovations in a very rapid way. So it is really understanding that there is a community that has an interest in raising everybody's capability for the purpose of being able to support specific things that use that to package value in a specific way.
But that doesn't create any individuality in different types of businesses as you move out. I mean, it almost creates this, everybody's the same moving forward.
I would add that a really important part of open source is getting enough eyeballs on to make something that is credible, reliable, and resilient. You can't do that as an independent anymore.
I've got a development
So only
group of
with
10
open
people.
source can you have something that is, in a sense, future-proofed.
So drug companies, for instance, don't want to do that, right?
No, we're not talking about that.
I don't know.
But
I'm just
it
saying.
because they're
is
locked into an
really
economic
linked
tendency.
to collective intelligence. If you have a pattern that you believe works, you can codify the pattern. And so it allows us to extend our knowledge and extend our language for sharing things in a very elegant way. And so it's scaled up to support lots of knowledge and lots of practices. And then I think from a behavior feedback point of view, it's been especially impressive. Not only does it codify it rigorously into some reusable algorithm, but it also decomposes the governance so that small groups can aggregate and configure bigger things. And it got to be better to be a small group than to be an IBM. And the Linux teams 10 at a time could outperform IBM with their big 360 development teams. And that gives you a different hope and a better approach maybe for how to do community intelligence. That we actually can take our problems and decompose them into groups of 10. And if we get really good at getting the feedback across the groups of 10 to collaborate, that's how we're going to get a lot of things done. And I think the hope is, I mean, it's hope fun to put your bet on silver bullet from new technology. But I think the thing from some of the older cultures like Japan and China and India is that the old patterns are coming back. The old pattern of traditional medicine, holistic medicine, is kind of preventative. The old pattern of cities that go way back to Rome and Beijing, Qinghua, those had mixed use human scale patterns that still make sense. And the Japanese garden, that was spiritual in terms of, you know, the candle and the moss and the rocks being worshipped. We're understanding that we need to go back to the Olmsted template, park by park, group of 10 by 10, you know, balancing this thing. I think that's a very encouraging thing.
Walking is hip again. Right? No one needs any energy, you know, they can live outside with no energy. We die in 3 days without water. And we can walk to water. We can't walk to energy.
One other comment on open. There's open source. There's also open data. There's also open sharing within any community. And when I can reach the point where the monetization of our actions is something that benefits a community, that I think that we have leveraged openness pretty much to a good extreme. Just point out those differences.
My concern would be also, though, that like Amazon takes advantage of open sourcing, but also artificial intelligence that puts it all together in a way that nobody else can.
I mean, there's a lot to be said about that.
Yeah, literature.
This might be a shift in the conversation, but I'm wondering, when we talk about communities, and we talk about people getting together and really like building these robust communities of people, we're assuming that just by putting people in that environment, they would have the time and the resources to be part of the community. And we have a cultural issue in the United States and many of the developed countries. And if you don't have that history and that kind of robust culture, you have the work culture. And you have people who don't have time to go out and walk through the park and meet with friends and have a barbecue in the neighborhood and, you know, get together and do a concert or have some kind of social event. They don't have time for that. They have kids, they have jobs, they have 2 jobs, 3 jobs, they have all of these other pressures. And just building these environments doesn't solve that problem. So are you engaging with the private sector? Are you working with the work culture in the industry where people have to work? How do you balance those two kind of competing factors, especially, you know, in the United States? I think it's probably an even bigger issue because we don't have some of those historic traditions as a, you know, entire nation. So you see those problems like really really, when you have all of these cities with different groups together, you have a challenge to really create that kind of community if you don't have the time.
I think you're seeing pushback from the people that are part of that workplace experience, and that your new workers are demanding a much more balanced life out of what they're getting. They're refusing to go into that 3-job type of a situation, and your employers are reacting to that, and that's part of them trying to set up those cultures, but it's something that really has to happen, that the businesses are being forced to adapt to the wellness side of environments and the workplaces that they're offering. That whole, I'm going to live the job 24/7, you're getting a lot of pushback from the people that are entering into those opportunities. I wanted to throw out one of the pieces why a lot of AI scares me as to how it could be misused, and I always have to go back to the reality that it's here, and we need to figure out how to use it the best way that we possibly can, because it's not going anywhere, and if we leave it to somebody else to figure out how to do it, it's not going to be the way that we want it.
I think part of the opportunity, it's a really good question. I think it's at the heart of what we need to do to manage the technical things, to spin them positive. How do we get a better economic framework around this? And I think part of the excitement about smart cities is that the city-based economy gives us many more choices to experiment with economic models that have different amounts of common sharing and different amounts of private, open data and private data, open commons services and private services. And so I think the approach of experimenting with more models city by city is quite good. And culturally, city-states have a lot to offer. So the Nordic cities have many configurations that help with that. And then the energy economy, that with renewable energy is getting cheaper. So that allows us to have an abundance of energy choices, which allows us to reconfigure our economy. So I think those economic experiments are really coming. And you, like Kate Raworth, is that her name? The Oxford professor that talks about the household economy and the donut economy. She's very far along on addressing those issues if you want to read up on how to get that some life balance kinds of choices economically. And I don't think it's, because the US has a lot of cities, Portland can run a different set of experiments on that than Houston for sure.
But I also want to just, we're at 3:00 now, so we're happy to linger and talk for 15, 20 minutes. If anyone needs to go, feel free. I want to thank you for being here and coming to our session and contributing.